Principal Wolf, Deputy Provost Banishment, family and friends, class of 2013, congratulations. And thank you for this honor. One morning last March, I wrote a public letter expressing my disagreement with the policy change here at Queen's that had been initiated by the School of Graduate Studies. That same day, a few hours later, from another part of the forest, I received this generous invitation to come here and be the convocation speaker. This strange timing was coincidental, I think, but it is a fitting anecdote that sums up my 20 years of teaching here at Queen's. This institution often frustrates and disappoints me, but it also includes me and it rewards me. They're very powerful people. I expect your experience here, students, was probably a combination of frustration and belonging, and I'm really sorry if it was only one or the other. As you prepare to leave Queen's, you will probably eventually find yourselves in another institution, another school, a company, an NGO, a government department. And so here's the question I want to leave you with. How do we make our lives within institutions with which we don't always see eye to eye? How do we create positive change? I don't look like someone who doesn't fit in here, although not so long ago, a woman on this stage would have been an anomaly. You will notice, perhaps, that I'm dressed in a Queen's gown. I got my PhD here in 1991, and in fact, I'm one of those people that goes back generations. My parents attended Queen's in the 1950s. They were married next door in Theological Hall. I cherish a beautiful photo of them sitting on the lion statue down the road at Lake Ontario. You probably passed it a million times. My parents enjoyed their time here, and they were happy that I ended up attending Queen's as well. When, to everyone's surprise, certainly my own, I ended up getting a job here, I will never forget how proud my father was as he helped me move into my shabby first office in Watson Hall. I'm in the much more palatial Macintosh Quarry Hall now. I know that your parents are feeling just as proud of you at this moment. But we aren't the kinds of people whose names appear in alumni magazines or on the fronts of buildings. My parents' lives didn't turn out the way they had hoped when they gazed starry-eyed at each other at that lion statue in 1953. And I, their daughter, as much as I love my job, often find myself in conflict with the direction and the culture of this institution, which has educated 2 generations of my family. So how do we create institutional change? Canadian musician Leonard Cohen sang famously, "They sentenced me to 20 years of boredom for trying to change the system from within." I don't advocate that, and happily, I have rarely been bored here. Let me pause here and give a great shout out to the idea of the university in general. Whatever problems we have, this is a place where it's okay to talk about root causes. It's okay to seek verification through collecting scientific data or census data. It's okay to commit sociology. It seems silly to have to defend these values, but today we do. My manifesto for change comes less from ideology, as I might have thought when I was your age, and more from relationships. How do you survive in institutions that sometimes feel like they box you in? I find inspiration in the relationships I make inside and outside the box. My inspiration comes from you, it comes from students. My inspiration comes from Scott, who grew up in a small town in Northern Ontario that was so famous for its flagrant anti-Aboriginal racism that it was known as Canada's Alabama. It also created a generation of very sharp Aboriginal leaders and intellectuals, 30 years before OHA, 40 years before Idle No More. Scott came to Queen's for his PhD to study this because even though he grew up in this town, he'd never heard of any of this. It had vanished from the historical memory of his community, at least among non-natives like him. My inspiration comes from Mary, who grew up in apartheid-era South Africa, who came to Queen's to study the history of public health in her country. Mary experienced all of the deprivations a white minority government imposed on young black girls growing up in 1980s South Africa, while Nelson Mandela was in prison, not in Parliament. But despite that, here she learned about a hidden history of white people cooperating with black people in her country's past to solve public health problems. She never learned about that before either. My inspiration comes from Zaira, who's here from Cuba studying the experiences of her generation, who have, like millions of young people from the global south, left their homes to come and work here in the first world. Zaira is learning that as well as being units of much needed revenue sent home to support their families, her generation of poor but well-educated Cubans are creating film and other cultural records of their experiences which reflect on what it means to be citizens of this lopsided, unequal world. And finally, I've learned from years of undergraduate students with whom I've worked in Havana in our unique, intense Cuban Studies course where the lights and the power go out all the time. It's a course we've just come back from, a course that I'm privileged to share with Professor Krull and Lord. The best part of this experience has been watching Queen's undergraduates learn that despite the inequalities inherent in their considerable economic advantage compared to their students, their fellow students in Havana, and certainly their instructors in Havana, despite that, reciprocal cross-cultural learning relationships and even friendships can thrive. Here's a quote that I quite like from a wonderful American journalist, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who writes for The Atlantic. He writes for theatlantic.com. He sums up exactly, in my mind, why we should be offering more courses like the one we're privileged to teach in Havana. Quote, if you are not around people who will look at you like you're crazy when you make stupid claims about other people's experiences, then you tend to keep saying stupid things about other people's experiences. So these are just a few of my inspiring students, and I tell you about them because I'm pretty sure that you also want change. And to do that, we all need inspiration. Rather than pouring water on your youthful notion that a better world is possible, I want you to turn up the heat. I want you to go out and help to make a world in which there are more than 2 global development choices. Sweatshops that fall down on their workers, and sweatshops that don't fall down on their workers. You know that we need to do better than that. My inspiration also comes from music. If any of you took Dance 100 from me, you already know that. And so I'll leave you with the words of Carlos Barrera, a Cuban musician I think so highly of that I've just spent 3 years working on a book about him. He writes about love, contradiction, and history better than anyone I know. Desde que existe el mundo, hay una cosa cierta. Unos hacen los muros y otros las puertas. Since the world began, there's one thing certain. Some make walls and others make doors. I hope you found at least a few open doors here, and as you leave Queens, I hope you're inspired to make many, many of your own. Thank you.